the process you have to go through in researching church history as to what is a group that might be a part of the Church of God movement and what might not. So this is lecture number 14 on church history. We're entering into the period that is basically what we're starting is the Thyatira era of God's church. What we've been talking about up so far has been Ephesia, Smyrna, and Pergamos. Now, as I go through some of these, ask yourself whether now, unfortunately, as I've said, most of what is written about the Church of God is written by its enemies. So you have to put on your detective's cap to go through and read and does this sound like a Church of God movement based on what the enemies say of it? And they're not going to be accurate. If you were to read our enemies on the internet, the Living Church of God, what they say about us is not accurate. And it was probably no different in those days. However, there's some of these that we're going to be, and primarily what we're doing is we're talking about movements headed up by an individual. And so we'll be talking about what that individual is said to have taught, and you can kind of get an indication who's at least more on track and who's less. Now, one curveball in all of this is that I've come to really appreciate how much of the truth God has given the Philadelphian era. We have more truth and a better and broader understanding of the truth than any other era in the past, including the Ephesian era. Clearly, hands down, far and away. And in particular, these Middle Ages groups tended to be very affected by Catholic teaching. So they're coming out of the dogma of the world the religious world that they were a part of then was much harder than it is today. They didn't, if you were to, God had to reveal everything to them because naturally they couldn't discover it for themselves, which is true certainly today for us. But Mr. Armstrong had the benefit of commentaries and research books and archaeology and historical writings. These people didn't. In many cases, they were barely literate. Now, certainly you have people like Peter Waldo, whom we'll talk about more next lecture, who were educated people. But Peter de Vries, whom we will talk about today, is one person who just didn't appear to be all that well educated. But so here we're approximately at the beginning of the Thyatira era, which I think I passed out an updated chart on that, would be about 1100 AD, running through about 1575 AD. We're going to look first at the movement that was led by Peter de Vries. De Vries is spelled D-E, capital B-R-U-Y-S. And this was a movement that was active in southern France. Now, what tended to happen as the Church of God spread, we heard it last time about the Paulicians and the Bogomils, who were part of the Pergamos area. You had, we go back to the Ephesian era. The Ephesian era was centered initially in Jerusalem. Then, upon the destruction of Jerusalem, they moved to Pella, which was in what we would call Galilee today, or Syria, that area. Not Galilee, Syria today, because they were across the Jordan, on the other side of the Jordan, in an area that was called in the New Testament times the Decapolis, meaning the 10 cities, which were Roman colonies that were set up in that area. Because of persecution and the difficulty of communication, we really, really underestimate how difficult it was in the Ephesian era to maintain any kind of proper government and control of doctrine. So after the church, the control seemed to be fairly good up until about 70 AD when the church moved to Pella, and it lost touch with many of the Western churches in Rome and in Spain and in what we call France today. And those are the churches that started to go off into false doctrine very quickly. But the church continued. It moved from Pella primarily to Antioch and then into Asia Minor, which is where the church primarily was centered, what we would call Turkey today, at the time of the writing of the book of Revelation in about 100 AD. The church was primarily centered then in the area of the seven churches, which is kind of why Christ used that male root as a metaphor for passing on his prophecies. At that time, the church was called the Nazarenes. Not all of the Nazarenes were necessarily Church of God. Most of them were, apparently. And as we get to the end of the Ephesian era, the beginning of the Smyrna era, that term continued to be applied. The Nazarenes, they were also derisively called the Judaizers. Why? Because they kept the Sabbath and the holy days and the Ten Commandments and the traditional doctrines of the church. What are we called today? A lot of people call us Jewish Christians. There's a reason for that. So we're painted with the same brush they were painted back in the Smyrna era and Ephesian era. Then we got into the Pergamus era. Again, the Smyrna era ran from that's a difficult one to to draw the line in. Sometime in, let's say, 110, 125 A.D. through to about 450 A.D. is the Smyrna era. Again, heavily persecuted, not a lot of writings left over. In fact, almost nothing left over from them. Then the Pergamus era, which ran from about 450 A.D. to 1100 A.D. That era, as the Smyrna era moved into, or as the Ephesian era moved into Asia Minor, and then as they were persecuted, they moved in two directions. One is up toward the area, well, in fact, primarily up toward the area of Bulgaria and the Balkan area, okay? And then they were driven from there, and they also evangelized. They did the work from there and spread through the rest of southern Europe. So it wasn't active primarily in Scandinavia, as far as we know. However, even though it is not reported commonly in history, the church was active in areas like Great Britain. When the first Catholic missionaries got to Great Britain, they found a church already established which kept the Sabbath and the holy days. And they really scratched their heads over that one. Now, they buried that in their histories, but, Saint, the guy who, St. Patrick, he dealt with that in Ireland and Scotland as well. The church was already there. So, obviously, the thought is that one or two of the apostles had been up there. It's just part of the work that's not recorded. But at any rate, from the Smyrna era into the Pergamus era, they spread from Bulgaria. That was the reason they were called the Bogomils, which the term refers to people from Bulgaria. And they were also called the Paulicians because they were reputed to be very tied to the teachings of Paul. Not to the exclusion of everything else, but they weren't afraid to teach what Paul taught about the law and so forth. In the church? Not to my knowledge. We have I know a bunch of Armenian families, but not Bulgarians. I'm sure there's some of that descent in the church, but there's nothing left of the Pergamus era that way. But they were, they were very active in terms of doing the work, and therefore they spread, and their teachings, just as we found out in the worldwide era, during the era of Mr. Armstrong, we had a great number of people who joined the church, not because they were converted, but because the truth makes sense. It's the only successful, clear, understandable, and logical way to explain the Bible. And so therefore, some people are persuaded strictly on the basis of logic alone, and that doesn't produce conversion. And that's kind of what happened in this era. As they spread, even in France, they were still called the Bogomils. And now they didn't necessarily call themselves this. This is what the persecutors called them. So if you'll recall, leaders in this era, Pergamus we're talking about, included Constantine of Milanese, who was stoned to death in 681. Simon, who, as I recall, Simon was the guy the church sent to persecute Constantine. And in the process of killing Constantine, he was so impressed with the man's devotion and zeal for the truth that he became converted himself and became the next leader of the church. And he was killed and burned at the stake in 687, and then Sergius in the late 700s. This is one of the few exceptions we have is that one of the writings of the Bogomils was preserved. It was called the Key of Truth. I believe, Mark, you said you had that. Have you read through it at all?
Parts of it, but very hard to follow.
It's very hard to follow. And what you're persuaded on with them is that they didn't really have a good grasp on the truth. And yet they were God's people. Many of them were. I'm not going to say that the Key of Truth is anything that I'd necessarily put a lot of stock in, but it's very interesting to read where their heads were at and realize how much affected, how much compromise they've been involved with. So, okay. So then we start to get now into the Thyatira era, and here we're dealing primarily with groups, especially in France. This was a hotbed of heretical activity at the time. There could have been remnants of the church, and probably were, in the mountains of Switzerland and Austria, what we call today, who still existed there to preserve the truth. We just don't have a lot of records about them because they weren't that active. Where we tend to have records is where they were really active and successful. That's what got the Catholic Church's attention, is when these people started making an impact. They did things like they'd throw pedophile priests in prison. That was a problem. They'd take these guys and they'd throw them in prison. They'd start saying that churches weren't important. People would quit paying their tithes to the Catholic Church. This got the Catholic Church's attention. Where they were most successful is where they tended to have the most written records exist of them. Somebody had a question over here? Okay. So we start out looking at the ministry of Peter de Brise in the early 1100s. Now, this was in southern France primarily. He existed, and he was not in isolation. When they went up there to persecute him, they acknowledged that there were other movements led by people they don't name who were evidently remnants of prior work by the Pergamus era. There's some interesting things about Thyatira, so let's turn to Revelation 2 and start out by reading the message that Christ gives to Thyatira. Revelation 2, verse 18, "And the angel of the church of Thyatira write, These things says the Son of God, who has eyes like a flame of fire and his feet like fine brass. I know your works." And he says that to virtually every era. "Love, service, and faith, and your patience. And as for your works, the last are more than the first." Now, why does Christ mention this? Because that didn't tend to be the case. Most of the time there was a revival under an apostle, somebody who reestablishes the truth. There is a ramp-up period of where the church grows. Now, it's different, interestingly enough, the Philadelphia and Laodicean era. In most of those times, what tended to happen was the church was successful, it grew, and its success got the attention of both the secular government and the Catholic Church. And then persecution began, and under the pressure of persecution, the church began to compromise, and the growth went like this, both physically because people were killed and because people compromised. And they tended to end on a whipper, therefore. But what happened with Thyatira, Christ said, is that they went like this. So we'll get into that a little bit more next time with the work of the Waldensians and Peter Waldo. "As for your works, the last are more than the first. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you, because you allow that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants to commit sexual immorality and eat things sacrificed to idols." Now, this is a direct reference to the example in the Old Testament that when Israel was corrupted, how did Balaam do it? He got was it the Midianites? I forget who it was. He got them to entice the men of Israel into sexual immorality as a part of the process of apostasy, really, because they were called to be, in terms of teachings and in terms of behavior, separate from the world around them. And Balaam said, that's what you have to attack. He told Balak, go ahead and get them to intermingle with the people sexually, especially, because all of that will lead to a corruption of their devotion to God. And they were right. Well, Jesus Christ uses the same analogy here in talking about the woman Jezebel. Now, he's not talking about literal sexual immorality. He's talking about spiritual sexual immorality. What does Christ use later on when he prophesies about the whore? He says, those who have committed fornication with her. He's talking about a spiritual process of compromise and intermingling with the false doctrines of the world. God calls that spiritual sexual immorality. So I have a few things against you because you allow that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, she claims to be a church of God, a representative of God, to teach and seduce my servants to commit sexual immorality and eat things sacrificed to idols. Now, I believe we covered this last time with regard to the Pergamus era, that was part of the process that happened with the persecution. And brethren, I hope none of us sit in judgment of the people of this era, because none of us have had to face this, where you knew that unless you compromised, your family as well as yourself would be killed. People began to come up with creative ways to compromise. They would send their kids to be baptized by the local Catholic priest, saying, well, it isn't real baptism, so it doesn't matter. They would go to Catholic Mass, but inside they're not really Catholics. We're not the only ones that have done this. There were Jews that did the same thing throughout, who theoretically, and in fact, isn't there supposed to be a movement of them or archaeological evidence of them or in the Southwest? Isn't there supposed to be people who still think that there are remnants that exist in the Catholic Church? They're hidden Jews.
Practicing Catholics, but they practice Jewish.
Okay, so we're not the only ones. The Church of God is not the only one who's come up with this compromise. Christ is saying, and this is a tough message, brethren. He's saying you'd be better off dying for your faith than compromising. And he's right. What's the purpose of being a Christian if we throw it all away because we've got our limits past which we won't go? Either we're totally dedicated or we're not. And if you've suffered as much as you have with your family, I was just talking to a New Perspective member over in Arizona. The lady's on fire for the truth. It's just wonderful. She's teachable. She's just, to me, it's just a joy to deal with people like that. But she's being rejected by her family, ostracized by her family, having no end of difficulty upon that. That's the worst most of us deal with nowadays. And I've seen people compromise under that pressure. How much more if you have somebody chasing after you with an axe wanting to lop your head off or wanting to kill your children? That's pressure to compromise. And it was unremitting throughout the Smyrna era especially, and then even in the Pergamus era. Again, with success, the church, in terms of preaching the gospel, the more impact it had, the more persecution it generated. The more persecution it generated, the more compromise tended to result. The more compromise resulted, the more energy the movement lost, and then they petered out. So there were remnants left there, as I mentioned, we'll get into with regard to the work of Peter de Bries and Arnold Lebresca and Henry the Deacon and some others. So anyway, this woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, teaches and seduces my servants to commit sexual immorality, this compromise with the mother church, a harlot. And I gave her time to repent of her sexual immorality. He's talking about these compromising people especially, and they did not. Indeed, I will cast her in, actually he's talking about the harlot church, because he says, I gave her time to repent of her sexual immorality, and she did not repent. It's interesting that God is saying here that even this movement that was centered in Rome, very early, to compromise and with the Gnostic teachings and etc., to come up with a new and improved version of the truth, which is happening in our era, isn't it? To make the truth more appealing to more people. And their goal was, that compromising church, their goal was to become the church that dominated the Roman Empire, and they achieved that goal. They were a political church. God is saying that there were some of those people who were involved in that whom he was probably still working with. He gave them time to repent of their sins, and they did not. Indeed, I will cast her into a sickbed, and those who commit adultery with her into great tribulation. Now, you could say that prophecy is dual, in the sense that you look at the turmoil that even the Catholic Church went through. It wasn't a happy experience to be a Catholic in Europe throughout the Middle Ages. It really wasn't. You were in bondage to this Romanish system that was very, very oppressive. So in a sense, he could have been referring to that, but certainly he's making this as an overall statement because he's talking about the Great Tribulation, which doesn't take place until well over about 1,000 years after the period it's known as the Thyatira era. He says, I will cast her into a sickbed, and those who commit adultery with her, those who compromise with her, which is the message that the consistent message he gives to the Church of God through Revelation 2 and 3 is don't compromise. So those who compromise with her into great tribulation unless they repent of their deeds. I will kill her children with death. Now what are we talking about? Who are the children of the great whore? Daughter churches. So the Protestants. And all the churches will know that I am he who searches the minds and the hearts. And I will give to each of you according to your works, according to your choices. Now certainly that message exists for the world out there who choose, brethren, they are blinded. Yes, they're blinded, but they choose to be blinded. They choose not to pay attention to God. Was the nation in better shape when we had a moral foundation, even to the degree that the United States had it? Yes, we were. Our society was better, our families were better, our crime rate was lower. We've thrown all that away by our choices to compromise as a nation. God says He's going to give to everyone according to their works. Now I say to you and to the rest in Thyatira, as many as do not have this doctrine of compromise, who have not known the depths of Satan, as they say, I will put on you no other burden. So he's saying, look, if you're able to reject this tendency to compromise and stay faithful, he says, I'm not going to pick at you anymore. There's a lot of the truth you don't understand properly, but he says, I'm not even going to get into that. Your willingness to stay faithful to the truth as you received it, he says, I'll honor that. I'm not going to put any other burden on you. But hold fast to what you have till I come. Acknowledging that they probably don't have all of the truth, but they have enough to make them the people of God. And he who overcomes and keeps my works to the end, I will give him power over the nations. He's got that same message of enduring to the end. He shall rule them with a rod of iron. They shall be dashed in pieces like potter's vessels, as I have also received from my Father, and I will give him the morning star. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Now again, Christ said that. There's two things Christ says it could be to every era. I haven't specifically checked, but I think it is nearly to every era. That he who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Those who are truly listening and applying what God said, versus applying human reasoning, leaning to their own understanding, being wise in their own eyes, and figuring out a better way to do it. This is what it was presented. When compromise was presented, it wasn't presented as compromise, lay down your standards. It's, look, if we do this, this will be an improvement. We'll appeal to more people. We won't get as much persecution. We're not compromising the basic truths. We're just making it easier for us to exist. That's the way the process started. That's why I said the Laodicean church is not criticized for doctrinal heresy, because they didn't have time to get into it. They would have gotten into it. 20 or 30 years from now, most who are a part of the 318 or whatever groups would not be a part of the Church of God. They'd be just as dead as the Sardis era was. They will get into heresy, and interestingly enough, the Sardis era, in its later stages now, which includes the Church of God Seventh-day Adventist, are going through the same liberalizing process that happened in worldwide. It's interesting to read about it. There's nothing unique. They are all being affected. They're reflecting the world and the society that they're in, which is the Laodicean era. So, anyway, this begins to become the start of a whole series of anti-Catholic movements that were centered especially in France. This gets all the way up to entire crusades that were waged against them, wars. At one time, and again, this shows you the degree of compromise. Later on, as we'll get into it, the church that started out powerfully under Peter Waldo eventually got into a political movement, formed their own governments, formed their own armies, and for a while were very successful until they aroused enough of the attention of the Catholic Church that they were obliterated, basically. So Peter de Bries, as a particular person, was a little is known about his background, what he came out of. He was known as a secular priest. Who knows what a secular priest is? I didn't either. I had to look it up in the Catholic Encyclopedia. Secular priest is, they were viewed as being two types of priests. They were people who were the cloistered priests that would be in, I guess, monastic type, withdraw from the world type thing. And a secular priest is a guy who runs the local Catholic Church. He's out in the world. He doesn't take the same vows that a Benedictine monk might take, even though they theoretically take vows of celibacy and poverty, but they can actually own property. A secular priest can own their own property, whereas a monk can't, really. So that's what a secular priest is. Ecclesiastical priest or a secular priest. His ministry lasted over about, they think about 20 years. He was burned at the stake in 1125 A.D. There's some doubt about that date, but it's not too crucial. It's interesting as I get to how he was burned at the stake. He was sometimes a little bit too zealous for his own good in some ways. He was succeeded by Arnold or maybe Henry and Arnold, I forget what the order is, whom we'll get to here as well. His primary opponent, or the guy that we have most of the records of Peter de Bries' work, is somebody called Peter the Venerable, who was a Catholic historian. He wrote a paper against the movement that Peter de Bries led, which his followers were called the Petrobrusians. That's Petro and Brusans. And they were successful enough that the Catholic Church had to send intellectual attacks against them, in effect. So that's why this guy wrote the Contra Petrobrusians. And he called Peter that wretched little man. He was no fan of Peter de Bries. They put down Peter de Bries as being poorly educated, as being crude. He wasn't from the upper echelons of society, and he was not an intellectual. Now, we'll get to what some of his teachings are. One thing that's unclear about the Petrobrusians is there's no clear evidence that they kept the Sabbath. So here, I mentioned the Sabbath and the holy days are necessary but not sufficient. So in other words, if we don't have a record of people keeping the Sabbath, it does exclude them on that basis. Or it does not exclude them because some of them could, it just wasn't recorded. But if they actively did not teach the Sabbath, we know they aren't a part of the Church of God movement. If they did teach the Sabbath, okay, that's one other qualifying thing, but it's not all. It's necessary but not sufficient. They were people who believed in works in the sense that they believed that true religion wasn't a process of just, certain number of rote ceremonies, attending Mass, saying a certain number of rote prayers, and confessing to the priest, and all of a sudden you're okay. They said all of that is garbage. They said true religion is living what God says. Okay, that's a good sign on their behalf, because that's true. But, without evidence strongly that they kept the Sabbath, it's a little difficult to be confident that this is a Church of God movement. The Dictionary of Sects and Heresies said, that's S-E-C-T-S, Sects and Heresies said, the sect of the Petrobrusians was one of the earliest anti-sacerdotal communities, meaning against the rituals of the Catholic Church, which the profound discontent inspired by the tyranny of Rome called into existence at the beginning of the 12th century. So he's basically saying they're one of the first movements, anti-Catholic movements, to arise, which led, this is a 400-year process that led to the Protestant Reformation. So people were dissatisfied and upset about the corruption of the Catholic Church then. It's just how they went about it, and more of society had to get to that point of disgust before the Reformation could actually take place, which was a carnal movement. Church of God had nothing to do with the Protestant Reformation. That's one of the things, by the way, brethren, as you deal with your friends, to make clear is the Church of God is not one of the daughter churches. We did not come out of the Protestant Reformation. We've been outsiders the entire 2,000 years. They've had their political movements, they've had their revolutions and counter-reformations and everything else going on within the broad stream of Catholic or so-called Christianity. That hasn't involved us at all. So here's how the Dictionary of Sects and Heresy said that the Petarusians were followers of an eloquent but ignorant heretic named Peter de Brise. So they looked down on him. He wasn't a graduate of the Harvard of the time. There's very little about him as a person. Even this reference book says, all of the information which has reached us of this remarkable person, remarkable why? Because he made a big impact of his time, considering the fact that he was an ignorant heretic. All of the information which has reached us of this remarkable person is contained in a tract or epistle composed for the refutation of his doctrines and addressed to certain bishops by Peter the Venerable. So this Contra Petrobrusians that Peter the Venerable wrote. Although the account of an enemy is always to be read with suspicion. So in other words, brethren, what I'm saying is, we're not the only ones that recognize that our understanding of these various movements that happened against the Catholic Church are based, unfortunately, upon the writings of the people that killed them. And so you can't take it totally as gospel by any stretch. The author says that the heresy had been coming to a focal point for 20 years prior to the appearance even of Peter de Brise. He was in an area of southern France, a region where degradation of the clergy had reached its lowest point of infamy. So things were getting so bad that basically this was a revolution against the religious authority of the Catholic Church, which is the reason, and because it succeeded to the degree it did, was the reason he was killed and they were wiped out or driven off. His principal doctrines were more ably extended by his more powerful successor, Henry the Deacon, whom we'll get to later. But the capital charges on which he is arraigned are, number one, he rejected infant baptism, alleging that no miraculous gifts were possible in that ceremony. In fact, later on, he made an interesting statement. He says, since infant baptism is not valid, and since all of Europe is Catholic, there have been no converted people in Europe. Yeah, again, that's not a type of statement that gets you a lot of popularity with the religious movement of the time. He denied that any special sanctity resided in consecrated buildings, and in his movement he forbade the building of churches. Indeed, he said they should be torn down. Now, what are Catholics just huge on? It's building these huge cathedrals and so forth. In particular, number three, he objected to the worship of the cross. He said the cross was a representation of torture. Why in the world would we venerate it? Can't argue with that. He alleging that the accursed tree should be held in horror by all Christians as the instrument of torture and death of the Redeemer. Number four, he denied any sort of real presence in the Eucharist. For those of you who are Catholic, the transubstantiation doctrine, where the blood and the bread or the wine and the bread are supposed to become literally the blood and the flesh of Christ, which is really a weird doctrine. But so they're not sure whether he had any kind of tie to communion at all. In other words, whether he even kept the Passover is unsure. He was bitterly opposed, number five, to ritual prayers, oblations, alms, and other good deeds done on behalf of the dead. Baptism for the dead, that type of thing. Besides these five capital errors, is what Peter the Venerable said about him. There's capital errors meaning he could have been killed by the Inquisition on any of these things. I'm not sure the Inquisition was formally formed by now. Did I say anything about that last time? Forget when the Inquisition, we're going to have to look that up, when the Inquisition actually started. It could be during this era because it really came to the forefront in the persecutions and the crusades that were against the Waldensians and so forth. But anyway, in addition, these 5 errors, which form a lot of the arguments that Peter the Venerable had in his Contra Petrobrusians, must be added a total prohibition of chanting and all use of sacred music. Now, that kind of strikes on our ears. He says that music was for bar rooms. It didn't have anything to do with, but you have to understand that ritual chanting, Gregorian chants and all this other type of stuff was an integral part of Catholic worship at that time. So he's reacting against that mostly. He was not an ascetic, which is important because some of his later followers were. As an ascetic is somebody who, kind of accepts the influence of the monastic movement in the Catholic Church. They don't eat much. They don't get married. They withdraw from society. Remember how the Bogomils kind of had that problem where they had the perfecti and you had to be celibate and you couldn't eat meat anymore and various other stuff. These are errors. But Peter de Bries, was not an ascetic. He required marriage. In fact, he even required some Catholic priests in the area where he had control, because he got to the point where he was a political movement as well. He required them to marry against their will. So, and he abolished all the fasts of the church. Now, again, he's not talking about personal fasts, and we don't know what his teachings were on personal fasts. He was talking about the ritual fasts of the Catholic Church, like Lent. And if you study Catholicism, there are a lot of other fasts as well. And their idea of fasting is you give up red meat for a week or whatever. He abolished all the fasts of the church. And so this is one thing Peter the Venerable wrote about him. He was having such an effect that people are rebaptized, which they would need to be if you were baptized as an infant. Church of God doesn't accept that. Churches are profaned, altars are overturned, crosses are burnt, meat is eaten openly on the day of the Lord's Passion, Sunday. Priests scourged, monks cast into dungeons, and by terror or torture forced to marry. Strangely enough, this popular heretic, again, reading about this, you get the impression he was a pretty rough and ready guy. Probably more like Friar Tuck in a sense of than he was any kind of sophisticated, pinky-fingered bishop or anything. He was out leading a band of his people, destroying churches and burning crosses and so forth. And he cooked his last meal over a pile of wooden crosses that he was burning. And unfortunately, he got a little ahead of the people in the region he was in, who got upset at him coming in, destroying their churches and burning their crosses. And so they lynched him. They killed him. They didn't lynch him. They grabbed him and they threw him in the fire that he was cooking his last meal on. So that's how he died. This happened in about 1225. Was that? Wait a second. That date doesn't seem to agree with... Yep. No, 1125. Yeah, 1125. Peter de Bries. Now, that's all we really know about Peter de Bries. Was he a part of the Church of God movement? It's hard to tell, but it's a little doubtful. Without evidence that he was a Sabbath keeper, that he taught the Sabbath, without some other evidence, I think that one of the things... There are two things that happen when a movement like this happened, and we'll read about additional ones of these. One is that it opened up what you might call some religious pluralism, tolerance, where the Church of God could operate in the Reform environment where it was suppressed in the Catholic environment. Now, the other reaction was, during the Protestant Reformation, Lutherans were very intolerant of anybody who didn't hold to the Lutheran line. So it was kind of like you switched the religious persecution of the Catholics to the religious persecution of the Lutherans. Martin Luther was very intolerant of anybody who didn't go along to the point of killing him. He was no better than those he came out of in that regard. So I would venture that amongst the relaxed or the more open environment that Peter de Bries operated in, the Church of God was probably operating as well. But what would tend to happen is that as happened in the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther studied the Sabbath. He saw the truth about the Sabbath, some say, but he wasn't willing to go there. It was too much. It was too radical. So I think that probably happened even in the time of Peter de Vries. So chances are the Church of God was accurate, especially since later movements came out of the same area. So you have evidence that the Church of God had to be operating in that area because they generally came out of the efforts of previous eras of God's church or previous activities of God's church. But we don't have any direct reference to who their leaders might have been.
He was so contrary to the Catholic way, it could almost logically say he would be keeping the Sabbath because the Catholics would be keeping Sunday.
Well, look at how Martin Luther got very contrary as well. Although he basically, if you look at what the teachings of Lutheranism are, they aren't that far removed from Catholicism. So you might be right. So, it's one of those things, though, because we have no other written records, we're only guessing. But it's kind of interesting. You see the process you have to go through. Now, again, where the records get more extant, that's when we can begin to identify individual preachers. And we get down all the way into the Sardis era. We have sermons written by Stephen Mumford that are preserved. And we can see the guy had the truth. It's clear. We don't have that type of stuff now, so we're really shooting blind. Now, the next one to follow Peter de Vries was Arnold of Brescia. He started preaching, oddly enough, in Rome in about 1145, even though he was from France. That's where he got his start. For some reason, he had the backbone to go right to Rome to start his preaching. This got him hanged, burned at the stake, and his ashes thrown into the Tiber River. So this is not an era of religious tolerance, let's put it that way. Arnold of Brescia was very politically oriented. He was a political as well as a religious reformer, which is probably why he went to Rome. That was the political and religious center of the world at that time. He believed that the root of all evil in their society was the wealth of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, he did, in his favor, he did use the Bible as the authority. He rejected the quoting of tradition, which, if you understand how the Catholics approach things, tradition supersedes the Bible. He rejected that, but he kept all of his reform efforts within the context of the Roman Church. And it did him a lot of good. It didn't go over any better then, too. His followers went into hiding, and the thought is that their going into hiding later on began out of his followers going into hiding began the Waldensian movement that we'll get to next time. From A History of the Christian Church by Schaff, we read, during the papal reigns of Innocent II, which he wasn't, and Eugene III and Adrian IV, occurred the interesting episode of Arnold of Brescia, an unsuccessful ecclesiastical and political agitator who protested against the secularization of the church and tried to restore it to apostolic poverty and apostolic purity. Well, we've heard that theme, haven't we? Apostolic Christianity. He proclaimed the principle that the church and the clergy, as well as the monks, should be without any temporal possessions. In other words, he saw that money was corrupting the Catholic Church, so he said they should have no monetary possessions at all. That the tithes that were paid should go strictly toward the support of the efforts of the church, not into buildings, not into art, not into et cetera, et cetera. Just like the Christ and the apostles, the ministry should live from the tithes and the voluntary offerings of the people. Their calling is purely spiritual. All things on this earth belong to the laity and the civil government. So he's not saying that you turn the tithes over to the laity and civil government. He's saying you use the tithes not to build great edifices in St. Peter's and et cetera. You use it to proclaim the gospel and to serve the church and spend it that way. You don't spend it on wealth, because this is a time when some of the priests, some of the bishops and cardinals were filthy rich people. They controlled immense estates, political control as well as religious control. He practiced what he taught and begged his daily bread from house to house. He was a monk of severe ascetic piety. enthusiastic temper, popular eloquence, well-versed in the Scriptures, restless, radical, and fearless. He agreed with Catholic orthodoxy, except on the doctrines of the Eucharist and infant baptism, but his views on these sacraments are not known. With the political scheme, he combined a political one. With the ecclesiastical scheme, he combined a political one. He identified himself with the movement of the Romans to emancipate themselves from papal authority and to restore the ancient republic. Okay, have we heard enough? What would you say of the likelihood of Arnold being a leader of the Church of God? No evidence that he has any real tie to the truth at all. But it's in the environment of the reform efforts of Peter de Bries and others before him that he was even able to arise. So, there can be, it's just like, there are churches out there now teaching the Sabbath and the holy days that don't acknowledge where they got it from. To me, it's linear. All you have to do is go back 20 years ago. They weren't teaching it then. They are now. So they can be affected by the preaching of the truth. That was true then as well. Okay, we can leave Arnold to the ash heap of history. His ascetic tie, even though, again, the Bogomils had that, in their perfecti, they had it as well. But I'd be willing to bet you, again, and I want to stress this, the Key of Truth talks about the perfecti and the average Christian. I forget what the term they used for that was. But the perfecti were, the higher level Christians, and the leaders, the teachers. They were celibate, they didn't eat meat, various other things. They're very ascetic. Chances are that is not reflective of the Church of God movement, but is reflective of the movement that began as a Church of God movement in its latter stages of compromise, is when they began to manifest that, and that was what was recorded. So it sounds odd to our ear now, but probably early in the movement they didn't teach that. Now we come to Henry of Lausanne. He was a Benedictine monk, eloquent orator. Everybody said this guy spoke better than anybody they'd ever heard. Priests were so intimidated by his eloquence and his powerful voice that he was just in the area. They'd turn over their pulpit to him, and willingly. He was a very charismatic individual, apparently. Because of this charismatic capability and his powerful voice, he was very persuasive to a lot of people. The Dictionary of Sects and Heresies said, he was of imposing stature, wore a cropped beard and flowing hair, went barefoot in the winters, with a frame so robust as to endure the utmost rigors of the climate, and a voice so powerful that his adversaries compared it to the roar of a legion of devils. Two main focuses for him was the celibacy and the general lifestyle of the clergy. Again, from the Dictionary of Sects and Heresies, it said, Henry dwelt much on 2 points. Although a monk by education and by profession and practice a religious ascetic, he was emphatically the apostle of marriage and the uncompromising foe of the clergy. He had great influence, especially throughout southern France. Some members of his of the true church may have been represented in his movement, but by and large, the thought is Arnold was not a part of the Church of God. He actually died a few years before Arnold in 1149. He was viewed as being the primary successor. He was more viewed as being a successor of Peter de Bries than was Arnold. He was a monk. He never left the Catholic Church, so there's another strike against him in that context. So he rejected the doctrine of transubstantiation. He argued that for nearly 500 years, Europe had had no Christians not baptized in infancy, and therefore, according to the Bible, Europe had no Christians at all. Which, again, that's one of those statements that's sure to get you attention from the Catholic Church. So these three are noted by Protestants as being predecessors to what became the Protestant Reformation. Now, chances are none of the three were part of the True Church of God movement, but, and this is one of those things that I can only surmise, I can't prove this, but I'd be willing to bet you in the kingdom we'll have it verified. The energy behind the movements that allowed them to operate was probably the work of the Church of God in the background. It's just like what preserved the New Testament. When you see the writings of so many ante-Nicene fathers of the Catholic Church against various books of the Bible where they want to get rid of them, all the way up to Martin Luther, who hated the book of James. Why? Because it didn't agree with him. And yet they couldn't bury it. They burn it. They just, move into the area with the Church of God. One of the first things they did, anytime they moved into a village of the heretics, is they burned their books. Satan wanted to control what was in the Bible, and he couldn't. The true biblical text kept cropping up, and finally the Catholic Church threw in the towel and accepted it. That was evidently the primary job of the church through that era, was the preservation of the Bible, which is the truth, even if they didn't fully understand it the way they should. In many ways, they prepared people. The whole idea of getting people to question the established church and say, look at the Bible, look at this church, they don't agree. That process was like revolutionary for people to wrap their minds around. It took generations for people to begin to open their mind to do that. This is a time of blind obedience. The view was, that's why, if you recall last time I talked about that emperor that was made to absolutely humiliate himself before the Pope because of his fear of going to hell. Blind obedience. They didn't question what was taught. And there weren't very many copies of the Bible because at that time the Catholic Church controlled the Bible and didn't let you read it. So therefore the few people, almost every one of these people that were part of the True Church of God movement, came out of it by getting a hold of a copy of the Bible and actually reading it and thought, wow, this isn't what I've been taught. So an interesting process. And even so, the Protestants look upon Peter Waldo as being one of theirs, one of the predecessors of the Protestant movement. I don't think he was, but these three men and the movements that were behind them, which is more important, some of parts of those movements, generally, I'd be willing to bet a lot of the energy in their movements came from the leadership of the Church of God in their areas, were preparatory to the greater work of Peter Waldo, which we'll get to next time. But do you see the process you have to go through as you wade through? That's why I don't know, other than if you had a particular interest in studying these types of things, it's fascinating. I find it fascinating. You could go to libraries and read books, and what you're trying to do is find some kind of evidence left behind that these people taught the truth. And if you find out they teach the Sabbath and the holy days, Sabbath, let's start out with the Sabbath, that's a plus in their behavior, in their favor. But then you want to look at a bunch of these other evidences as well, and you have to wade through an enormous amount of material to glean very, very little. So obviously, God did not go out of his way to preserve the history of the church in the past 2,000 years. What we're covering has been the process that you have to go through to even trace it. And generally what you trace is a faint record. Now, as we get into the next session, which will be on Peter Waldo and the Waldensians, we're starting to finally get into an area. We have the key of truth from the Pergamus era. Now we're in the Thyatira era. We're starting to get into an area where there are some written records left behind. And then things get really interesting. We have more positive information. But even Peter Waldo, how much of his movement and those that succeeded him remained the Church of God is a little indefinite. But we do have a lot more in terms of written records to turn to. And then after really where it starts to blossom is when we get into the Sardis era. And that's going to be fascinating. Again, there's one particular book of sermons by Stephen Mumford and somebody else whose name we'll recognize, who were two of the guys that emigrated from England to found the Church of God in New England. A book of their sermons that I've talked to ministers who've read the book, and they said you could give sermons right out of that book today. That's kind of exciting to hear a common thread, because we identify with the ministry of Mr. Armstrong, but to go back. This is in the 1700s. We go back to with Stephen Mumford to go back to his era and read a sermon that I could virtually stand up and give today. That's kind of neat. So this one will be a relatively short one. Any questions, by the way?